Good morning. My name is Tyler McCann, and I'm the Managing Director of the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. Before we begin our discussion today, I want to acknowledge that I am participating in this webinar from Saskatoon. Saskatoon is located in the traditional territory of the Treaty 6 First Nations and the homeland of the Métis. As an organization, we recognize there are many steps on the road to reconciliation and that it is a journey that we must all take together. Agriculture and food in Canada is facing significant pressures, a unique and unprecedented confluence of market, environmental, and political volatility and disruption. It is in this context that we have recently released several reports and policy briefs covering topics like navigating trade, risk, and the need to move from optimism to realism, and federal agriculture program spending. In the coming weeks, we will be publishing reports about food security and the Indo-Pacific strategy, and another about approaches to business risk management programs in Canada. It is important that our work reflects the realities of the diverse and dynamic sector that we have in Canada. We do this in part through survey work and engagement. We currently have our 2025 risk survey open, and we encourage you to take 10 minutes to complete the survey. All we do at CAPI is made possible by partners throughout the agri-food sector and across value chains. Today's webinar is funded by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada under the Sustainable Canadian Agricultural Partnerships Agri-Competitiveness Program and is held in partnership with RealAgriculture. We're grateful for this support as we explore the current state of tariffs, their impact on Canadian agriculture and agri-food, and proactive solutions to safeguard the industry's future. Today we'll start with a dialogue between Sean Haney, owner of RealAgriculture, and Oliver Ward, International Trade Editor of AgriPulse, to set the stage with what we know about the state of trade, with a focus on Canada and the United States. After that, I will moderate a discussion with our panelists. But before I turn it over to Sean, we would like to hear from you. There's a poll that's going to pop up on the screen. Please take a couple of minutes to share your thoughts with us. We want to know from you, when you think about this and acknowledge the potential for short-term disruptions, do you think Canadian agriculture and food will successfully navigate the trade war? The options that we've given are no, we think that this will lead to structural change. Yes, we think it will with some help. Or I think Canadian agriculture will be the same in the end. So please take a minute, put your votes in, and let us know what you think about how well Canadian agriculture will be able to navigate this space. And we'll just give a couple of more seconds for that poll to close. And we'll take a look at the results, and then I will hand it over to Sean. So we have 67% have said that, yes, we think that Canadian agriculture will successfully navigate the trade war with some help. 28% said, no, this will lead to structural change. Only 5% saying that they think Canadian agriculture will be the same in the end. So Sean, I will use that to turn this over to you and to kick things off with Oliver.
Hey, thanks a lot, Tyler. Really appreciate it. So, Tyler, help from who, though? Who's helping?
Well, I think that probably the expectation is partly that's government, partly that's the industry itself. But maybe that's something we can get into it during the panel discussion later on in the webinar.
Absolutely. Well, hey, really appreciate everybody taking some time to be with us here this morning, wherever you are in Canada or beyond our borders. You know, at RealAgriculture and, you know, getting a chance to host Real Ag Radio on Rural Radio 147 every weekday, I get a chance to talk to a lot of Canadians, of course, and a lot of American farmers and ranchers as well on a daily basis. I spend my entire life in times like this explaining Americans to Canadians and Canadians to Americans, which is, I take that duty with great honor. And a part of understanding what's happening here right now in this landscape is, I think, you know, a lot of times we spend a lot of time thinking internally. We spend a lot of time thinking about what is Canada doing or not doing and being very introspective. And I think it's critical when going through times like this that we try to understand viewpoints, whether we agree with them or disagree with them, understand them from through other lenses and try to understand the other side's position on some of these very, very important manners. So let's dig in right now and get to that part of the program. I'm joined right now by someone who spends his whole day, his whole life digging in on trade, and we're very happy to have him here on this webinar and focused on the industry of agriculture. It is Oliver Ward. He is Trade Director at AgriPulse, based out of Washington, D.C. Oliver, it is great to be able to chat with you here this morning.
Likewise. Thanks for having me, Sean.
Yeah, so you've been in the U.S. for a number of years, and you came. Your entry into the trade arena was very much from a broader perspective. I guess as you look at being now focused on agriculture, are the agricultural trade issues that different than, well, obviously we're talking a lot about autos here this morning based on the auto tariffs, but obviously there's softwood lumber, there's autos, there's mining. Is agriculture that different?
Yeah, so thank you for having me. And as you say, I've been in the United States for 6 years now, in Washington, D.C., for about 5. Yeah, so my beat before joining AgriPulse was a trade policy beat covering everything. And I think from that perch, it looked like agriculture was quite a slim subsection of trade. Since taking on the beat full time, it's really broadened. You realize that you have stakeholders in agriculture, even in the US, state specific and region specific, that might have quite different trade policy goals and interests. And so in some senses, it's the same as other industries where you have this myriad of stakeholders. But I think in agriculture, because it is so broad and you have so many different commodities and so many different regions and so many different environments, it really is even broader, and there is more diversity of opinion and view.
And we know this, when there is trade skirmishes, trade battles, trade wars, agriculture seems to be drug in very early stages, especially at the raw commodity stage for sure. Okay, so you're spending a lot of time thinking about the U.S. strategy and trying to understand what's at work here. How would you characterize the overall U.S. trade agenda right now under President Trump in these early couple months?
Yeah. So on Inauguration Day, we got a memo from the White House, what it called its America First Trade Policy memo. And in that document, the president really sets his stall for his trade priorities under the second administration. Right in the first paragraph, we see language that rails against what the president describes as destructive trade deficits. So there's this real appetite to address the US trade balance. You can also see this in the president's rhetoric since, right? He said he wants to use trade policy to reshore domestic production, a whole raft of industries. He mentioned this in the press briefing yesterday, for example, when he announced those new tariffs on auto imports. So he really sees tariffs as a way to spur domestic production and bring that back to the US. Then there's also this notion of reciprocity that features very prominently in that document. I'm sure we'll come to the reciprocal tariffs that have been previewed for April 2nd. But this idea that we want to be treated in the same way that we treat you is clearly a key pillar of this administration's trade agenda. And I guess the third thing worth pulling out of this document is that there's a directive to the Office of the US Trade Representative to identify countries with which the US can negotiate new trade deals, either through a bilateral traditional deal or some sector-specific trade agreement that would open new markets in a specific industry. And this is particularly enticing for US agriculture. We've had 4 years under the Biden administration where they didn't do comprehensive FTAs with broad market access. And if we want to find those new markets, obviously there's a myriad of trade barriers that need to be addressed for US ag. Just one final point on it is that notice it doesn't mention those plurilateral or multilateral initiatives. So it is safe to say that this administration is going to pursue a bilateral approach to trade, deal making with maybe individual partners at a time, as opposed to some of these broader frameworks.
I think there are, for those of us that are trying to follow this on a daily basis, God help us, that we see differences between Trump 1.0 and Trump 2.0. I talked a lot about the need to make sure you're reading the right textbook. And so Trump 1.0, the art of the deal, negotiating, trying to find a better deal for the United States. In Trump 2.0, it's a lot more about it was in the poll, the restructuring. It's more Robert Lighthizer book, No Trade is Free, is more of the textbook at work. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, for sure. There are a number of differences between the first administration and the second administration. Not least for everyone watching it, as you mentioned, the pace is obviously breakneck for all of us.
Yeah.
In the first administration, it took a year and a half to impose new tariffs. They went through very specific investigations. They were adopted for very specific reasons as well, all of which are linked to trade. You know, we saw tariffs on washing machines, on steel and aluminium. The metals tariffs linked to national security. We saw the 301 tariffs, which are imposed to counter specific unfair trade practices. This time around, as you say, there's a broader realignment in the sense that we're thinking about trade differently. We're thinking about a broader countering of the trade balance. We're also thinking about reciprocity, but there's also a change in how the tariffs are actually being used as well. You know, I mentioned that those first administration tariffs. This time around, we're seeing them wielded to advance non-trade policy goals, right? So we had the tariffs on Canada and Mexico, for example, ostensibly to address migration or the flow of drugs. We also saw a very short-lived trade war, if we can call it that, with Colombia over the handling of deported migrants. And these are not trade policy issues, but tariffs clearly are still the preferred tool. You know, one other thing that's worth mentioning is he's also raising the issue of tariffs as a revenue raiser much more frequently, right? He suggested that, again, yesterday, that they could be used to fund other economic policy goals as well, like extending his tax cuts. So there are some quite large differences there.
But there's, I guess, can you use tariffs as a revenue generator and use it as a negotiating tactic? Because if you're using it as a negotiating tactic, you know, if you get what you want, you pull those back, which then all of a sudden you're reducing your revenue opportunities. We're still hearing about the External Revenue Service being launched to collect this money before it enters the United States. Are those two strategies in conflict, or do they complement each other?
They're absolutely in tension. And Erica York at the Tax Foundation has been particularly vocal about this, for example. As you mentioned, if you want to collect revenue from tariffs, they have to be imposed. And so if you're negotiating either pulling those back or delaying them or narrowing them, obviously, then that impacts the revenues as well. But I'd also like to add the third objective here as well, which might also be in tension, right? Is Trump has mentioned reshoring manufacturing and using tariffs as a way to do that. Well, if you're reshoring manufacturing, then you're reducing imports. And if people aren't importing the stuff, then the tariff is not being paid. And so if that objective is to use tariffs as reshoring manufacturing, then the reliance on tariffs as a revenue raiser also is somewhat undermined. Now, obviously, there are products that we can't make or grow cheaply in the United States. We put tariffs on those. Consumers will either have to pay the tariff or they will eradicate those from their spending habits. So there are products that are going to be tariffs would raise revenue on, but it's going to vary sector by sector, right? And I think some of the concern is that there hasn't been the time so far to do the kind of line by line industry analysis required that would be able to tell you which tariffs and which rates would be required to reshore, which would be required to use the tariff as a revenue raiser. And absolutely, yeah, those are in tension, and we'd need more analysis to work that out.
You know, if you compare media load of this topic, comparing Canada and the U.S., it's quite drastically different. If you watch the Canadian news at night, whatever channel you're following, it is this topic from start to finish, and a little bit on the Canadian federal election as well. To be fair at this point, because that's ongoing as well. But it is Trump and tariffs nonstop, front to back, and that's also influenced what's going on with our current federal election as well, as the polls have really flipped. Where does Canada? But in the U.S., that's not happening. It's not as predominant. Where does Canada fit right now as a discussion point, as an ally in the Washington bubble, as you talk to many of the people that are in that?
Yeah, so it may not be as prominent in the news. We've got a ton of issues competing for oxygen. Even just on the trade front, we have a myriad of issues. You know, this week there was a shipbuilding hearing that dominated headlines. But I would say Canada is featuring prominently in the agriculture discussions in Washington, D.C., right? The trade associations are particularly concerned about the tariffs on Canada because they see them as a double whammy to U.S. farmers. Obviously, the size of the Canadian ag export market is significant. You know, it's nearly $30 billion of U.S. ag exports. But tariffs on Canada also affect the input side of things for farmers in a way that tariffs on people like China and other countries do not. We know that we've heard in the media a lot of discussion about the potash that the US
Yeah.
farmers rely on. But there's also, agricultural machinery. I was speaking to someone from the Association of Equipment Manufacturers that said, a piece of raw iron crosses the border from the US to Canada 5 times before it becomes a piece of finished farm machinery. And then you've also got, livestock. The US ranchers import cattle for feeder herds. And so I think what Canada is getting a lot of oxygen in the agriculture community in DC because of those reasons. It doesn't just threaten the export market. It also puts pressure on those imports as well.
The question I get a lot is, as I talk to a lot of our Canadian audience, and we've just been through a pretty strong run here of different conferences across Canada and the U.S. Is a common question is, what do U.S. farmers think about this trade strategy? And that's there's data to talk about that. But from an ag industry standpoint, the ag industry is very focused on expanding export opportunities. You mentioned the Section 301, the shipbuilding probe regarding Chinese ships and trying to bring that manufacturing back to the U.S. Obviously, we've got lots of tariffs that are threatening some of the agricultural export opportunities. What sense do you get from the U.S. ag industry about the current state of the trade strategy?
Yeah, like you, we've had conference season, so I've been to a few of them in recent weeks. I guess we'll start with polling. There was a poll out, I think it was last week or yesterday, in the last few days from AgWeb that polled farmers and on their opinion of tariffs, and it showed that there's only like a tick above 50%. I think 54% disagree with the tariff strategy. So there is still really strong buy-in. We know that Trump carried rural communities in November, and there is speaking to ranchers and farmers, there is buy-in for this idea that if the tariffs incur some short-term pain, it will pay off in the form of long-term gain, right? I was at a meeting of farm cooperatives last month in California where somebody stood up in a room full of several hundred people and said we should all read Bob Lighthizer book. Bob Lighthizer being the architect of trade policy under the first Trump administration, because he said then we would understand why we need these tariffs. But even within that, as I said at the beginning, we've got a broad variety of views. Even within the ag sector, there is some nuance, because think about, soybeans and corn, they're not being harvested for some months, right? Yeah. So they can weather some trade turbulence for a little while. They're not going to feel that bite until after the harvest. And then even once they do feel that bite, their financial setup might be so that bills may not come due till near the end of the year. So there really is some nuance to this. Outside of Washington, the view is, I was speaking to a farmer from Kansas recently that said that their local farmers are willing to give Trump a really long runway on these tariffs. But there is nuance within that as well.
Yeah. So, and it's hard to predict the future in times like this, but with the kind of divided Congress that exists and global trade partners, pushing back, how much freedom does President Trump truly have to impose this agenda? Obviously you gave some numbers in terms of some of the support, but and what internal U.S. factors might limit his ability to act unilaterally going forward on this front?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. So without getting too in the weeds, the Constitution does give U.S. Congress oversight over U.S. trade policy, which they then divulge to the president. But so far, speaking to Republicans in Congress, many of them are willing to give Trump the benefit of the doubt so far, right? So I spoke to members on the Ways and Means Committee a few weeks ago on the use of these emergency powers to put tariffs on Canada and Mexico. So bear in mind, this is a novel use of those powers. They hadn't been used to impose tariffs on U.S. trading partners before. Nixon did something with a precursor of this power. But the members I spoke to, some of them who are free traders and fairly skeptical of tariffs for anything other than addressing unfair trade practices, all said they're willing to give Trump the benefit of the doubt, right? One of them even called these emergency powers and the fact that Congress gave them to Trump the original sin. But there was no interest in clawing any of these powers back. Now, it is worth remembering Trump ran on a campaign platform that included tariff proposals, including across-the-board tariffs and steep tariffs on China of up to, I think he floated 50% or maybe higher. and he won that election convincingly. And so many in Congress do see him as having a mandate for tariffs. And again, some of the lawmakers who led the charge on clawing back some congressional oversight in the first Trump term are no longer in Congress, like Rob Portman and Pat Toomey. So it's not totally clear where such initiative to do that and pushback would come from. But I have to caveat this because it's one thing not to challenge the president's use of executive powers, but it's quite another to support it in legislation. So some of this will depend on whether the president and the Republican Party want to use tariffs as an offset for some of their other economic goals in legislation. If that happens, we don't know. There might be some more pushback from Congress. And the other thing is once there is a reconciliation package that gets through Congress and some of these economic objectives are enacted in legislation, lawmakers might have a stronger footing to turn around and say, we delivered on your economic agenda, here are your tax cut exemptions. We haven't ignored the will of the voters, we've listened to them, but on the tariff front now, we can push back a little bit more. So it's really a fluid situation there as well.
Yeah, and April 2nd, next week, which the president has called Liberation Day for the United States, reciprocal tariffs. Now, a lot of R words here. Reciprocal tariffs are not retaliatory tariffs. I think everybody understands what retaliatory tariffs are. Canada has threatened, and other countries, Europe has as well, retaliatory tariffs. If you're going to do that, we'll do this. Reciprocal is different. What should Canadians be aware of when it comes to these reciprocal tariffs that supposedly are going to be launched on April 2nd?
Yeah, so it is quite murky right now. We've had, Scott Bessent last week suggested that they could be limited to a dirty 15, limited to a group of countries that's quite narrow to begin with. The president said yesterday that they would apply to every country. So we don't totally know what the scope of these are going to be. We also don't know how steep they're going to be. The president suggested in the last few days that he could be quite lenient and they may not be a total like-for-like tariff rate of average applied tariffs. So we don't totally know where they're going to land right now. What we can say is that countries have obviously taken different approaches to how to get ahead of these, right? Canada, the European Union, China, they're all retaliated, have signaled that they will retaliate to tariffs that have already been put in place. Although Europe has softened slightly in recent days in delaying its retaliation. And other countries, the UK, Vietnam, India, we've seen some suggestion of concessions to Trump. There's been reporting the UK is considering cutting its own digital services tax applied to US tech firms. India took the first steps this week towards dropping their DST. And Vietnam, I believe, has also talked about tariff cuts. And so there is a divergence in countries trying to get ahead of these, even though we don't know what they're going to look like yet. And so I guess we'll see on April 2nd how successful those efforts have been. I texted with someone from the UK government last week when they were in Washington, who seemed very optimistic after those meetings that both countries were on the same page and hoping to do something that would avoid those reciprocal tariffs for the UK. And Mexico may also be one to watch on that because they are a major US trading partner, but Claudia Sheinbaum's government hasn't responded with the same vigor as say, Canada or the EU. So they may end up being a bellwether here. But I would say, bearing in mind heading into those April 2nd tariffs, is we might get a sense of what the right approach is or what the more successful approach is to deal with Trump when he makes some of these tariff threats.
Yeah, you mentioned the AgWeb poll. Carolyn points out in the Q&A about the results, and I knew I had the results of this poll because I was the person that released the results fresh off the presses last week on AgriTalk when I was guest hosting. So here's the results. So the first question was, do you support President Donald Trump's use of tariffs as a negotiation strategy? 41% saying yes, 54% saying no, and just under 5% saying unsure. The next question was, do you believe the USDA will compensate farmers for losses if agriculture is affected by a trade war, similar to the compensation provided through the Market Facilitation Program? That's the MFP program it's often referred to. In Secretary Rollins' confirmation hearing, she talked about how she had talked to former Secretary Perdue about how he rolled out those MFP payments. 34% said only 34% said yes. That's an interesting piece because on AgriTalk last week we definitely chatted about the fact that that's less than we thought it would be. only 34% of people saying yes, they will be backstop, because I think that backstop, Oliver, to wrap up here, that's what holds people to the I'm with him part, is those backfill payments.
Yeah, we also know that the Commodity Credit Corporation, which funded those payments last time, is depleted. It has a borrowing authority of up to 30 billion. It doesn't have anywhere close to that right now, so that could also be playing on people's minds as well.
Yeah. I want to mention to everybody that if you do have a question, some people have already started to do this, put your questions into the Q&A section on Zoom here, and we'll get to as many of those we can in the back end of the program. Hey, Oliver, hopefully you're sticking around for some of the Q&A, but thanks a lot for joining us here today. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Likewise.
Hey, that is Oliver Ward. He's trade director at AgriPulse. Encourage you to check out AgriPulse's work. They are, Sarah and the entire team, Oliver there, are fantastic when it comes to covering ag policy issues from a U.S. perspective. Hey, Tyler, I'm going to pass it back over to you for the panel.
Great. Thank you very much, Sean. And just on the Q&A, if you go in and you see a question that you like, feel free to click on it and let us know, and we'll deal with those questions first. I'd like to get into the panel discussion now with our first panelist. We're very pleased and appreciate his time this morning. Ambassador Greg Dowd is currently the President and Chief Executive Officer with the National Milk Producers Federation in the United States. Before arriving at NMPF, he served as the Chief Ag Negotiator in the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative from 2018 until 2021. Before that, he worked in industry organizations and as a staff member on the Senate Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry. Ambassador Dowd currently lives with his family on their horse farm in Lothian, Maryland. Ambassador, I hope I got that town right, but maybe first we'll go right into the question. Going back to your time at USTR, you were really heavily involved in the renegotiation of the USMCA, but how do you we're not sure what that means today. We've got this trade deal. It had agreed to tariffs and trade relationships. How do you see the validity of USMCA and how it fits into everything that we see going on in Washington?
Well, the first thing I would say, Tyler, listening to the previous conversation is, why are you surprised by any of this? This is, standard operating procedure, and I don't want to be flippant about this. I would consider Canada obviously a very important trading partner. Obviously, USMCA is one of the most important trading partners, trade agreements that we have. For agriculture, Canada and Mexico are Mexico's number one, Canada's number two. But I would say this, and I don't want to be flippant, but Canada, you're not special. You were just first on the list. There's the message from President Trump is very simple and it's very consistent. Nobody gets access to the U.S. consumer for free. You get access to the U.S. consumer if you play by the rules. And when you're not playing by the rules, then we're going to have a pretty frank conversation. And the second time around, the conversation gets, we're more familiar with each other. With USMCA, obviously, in dairy, for example, we've had these conversations before. It's still not where we want it to be. So we're going to have another conversation about it. And it gets a little more frank than it was last time around. That's just the long and the short.
I appreciate that, and again, it's we'll come to the dairy in a minute because obviously there's a lot of interest in Canada about it. But again, without trying to be flippant about something that's really serious, I think a lot of people in Canada thought we were playing by the rules. We had thought that the rules had been written, that we had gone through that tough negotiation. There was back and forth, give and take at the end of the day. And I know we can. Again, we'll talk about TRQ administration shortly, but
yes, we will.
Yeah, I guess we had thought that the USMCA was the rules, but we found out that even playing by them hasn't been good enough anymore. So how does that fit into this kind of changing landscape that we're in?
Well, I think there's a lot of different things here going on, and I don't know what priority to put them in. I'm not, I can't read President Trump's mind, but I can understand a little bit of what he's thinking. And it's, yes, the fentanyl thing is an issue. Yes, people coming across the border is an issue. That not to be, uncharacteristic about this at all. Autos is always something that is top of mind for him. And it is very clear to me that in watching what is important to this administration is manufacturing coming back to the U.S. as Oliver described. This is top of mind, and he's trying to create a situation that makes it more advantageous for companies around the world and the world economy we live in today, is to bring that to the United States and not send it to Canada or Mexico or China or other places. There's a whole lot of things that go into that, including what we have to do domestically in terms of tax policy, regulatory policy, et cetera. And Robert Lighthizer talks about it in his book. I would also, Tyler, recommend everybody, and I mean everybody, listen to last week's Tucker Carlson interview with Robert Lighthizer when he lays it out in terms of the U.S. industrial policy. And Tucker says it very well. He says, why isn't the White House explaining this the way that you do, Bob Lighthizer? And I think that's something that, you know, answer some of your questions here, Tyler. This is what this is about, is the U.S. changing and trying to develop a more sophisticated industrial policy.
And I think it's something that we've been trying to point out as often as possible, is that I think while we all get caught up in some of the president's tweets and you know, tariffs, the most beautiful word in the English language, but there is quite a bit behind that language that gets all of the attention. The work again that you and Lighthizer did in the first administration, we're hearing more about this from Lighthizer now. I think if you read some of what Stephen Mirren has written, you get a better understanding of what the administration is trying to achieve. I think that there's a good argument to be made, though, that we could probably achieve some of those things together in a Fortress North America context, where we do have very integrated supply chains, that we might be able to doing it on our own. But maybe we can come back to that in a minute. Let's talk
on that, Tyler. I would just simply say that I think there was a little friction between your former prime minister and our president personally that caused some of this as well.
Well, and it's worth noting in some of the presentations I've done lately, I've been pointing out, Churchill's quote about never letting a crisis go to waste. I think the Liberal Party of Canada was some of the best at taking advantage of that opportunity, and we're in an election with a new prime minister today, and we'll see what the outcome of that is in a month, and hopefully that puts us in a better position where we can work together. Let's talk about dairy. I'm struck, Ambassador, you in your comments before Congress talked about the need for the administration to take a thoughtful and tailored approach to dealing with outstanding issues. Can you talk about what is the NPMF's position on these things, and how do you see in your mind the administration actually delivering that thoughtful approach to dealing with what the outstanding issues are on dairy and USMCA?
Well, the first thing I would say about USMCA is Ambassador Lighthizer was very clear about we're not doing trade agreements anymore where we never have an opportunity to change them again. And we have to keep in mind that when we negotiated NAFTA back in the late 80s and early 90s, that was before the internet even existed. And you have to refresh and renew this. And then you have situations like we have in dairy where we clearly knew what we wanted in the United States. We tried to reflect it in the language. We didn't get it right, obviously. We had the first dispute of the U.S. MCA dispute settlement system over this dairy issue. And it didn't end up the way we wanted it to end up in the U.S. And this is still going to have to be a topic of conversation going forward, in particular with regard to how the tariff rate quotas are administered. And so, we'll just leave it at that. It didn't end up the way it was intended from a U.S. perspective, and this is a conversation that has to be sorted out.
And I think that reality of regular reviews and trade agreements and effectively forcing that issue is something that certainly has a lot of merit and could have prevented some of the issues that we've seen over the last 30 years where the trade agenda hasn't delivered what it needs. But that dispute settlement mechanism in USMCA does also underscore the need for a functioning dispute settlement mechanism in whatever the trade deal is at the end of the day. But can you just, I do want to make sure that we're clear, and I think it's important. Sean talked about the need to understand the perspectives of Americans. What are the priorities for your organization when it comes to that USMCA review for dairy in Canada today?
Well, we want to have a situation where we feel like we've been granted access to the Canadian market in dairy, but the way the tariff rate quotas are allocated or administered in terms of who they're given to, they're not given to retailers in places where we can sell products to Canadian consumers. They're relegated or pigeonholed into the processing side of the equation where they just don't use it. And that's unfair. That was not the intent of the agreement, at least from the U.S. perspective. And so this is something that has to be relitigated and resorted out and fixed, in our opinion. And we're going to, from our U.S. standpoint, we're going to emphasize that.
Yeah, and I think we all look forward to being able to move past the current trade uncertainty and getting back into that NAFTA or that USMCA renegotiation. Thank you, Ambassador Dow. We'll come back to you again when we bring the whole panel, and I'm going to go to the next panelist, which is Travis Taves. Travis, thank you very much for joining us. Travis is a former finance minister for the province of Alberta. He also, with his wife, manages a ranching operation, and I had the first opportunity to meet him when he was president of the Canadian Cattle Association. Travis has worked globally to support Canadian interests in ag and international trade, and he and his wife Kim also own and manage an oilfield environmental company. Travis, let's go back and start on the farm in northern Alberta. When you're thinking about the impact these tariffs have or might have on your farm, what do you think that means, and how are you trying to mitigate, manage that impact?
Sure. That's a question that every agriculture operator should be asking these days, for sure. Look, we in North America, particularly Canada and the US, as Greg knows, we've really had an integrated cattle and beef industry. I believe it's been a mutually beneficial arrangement. We've been allies instead of competitors in large part internationally. But by virtue of having that integrated industry, of course, processing capacity has been built in the most competitive jurisdiction of the day. And as a result of that, we depend on some U.S. processing capacity at this point in time in our integrated industry. So bottom line is this. If there are tariffs on live cattle going into the United States, then it's going to have a direct and immediate effect on cattle prices in Canada. And it won't just affect the value of those cattle that are trading south of the line. It'll affect the price of every finished steer and heifer and every slaughter cow in Canada. That's the reality, because the only way to sort out which feedlot can sell cattle into Canada's processing system is through price. And we've experienced that during, the BSE days. We know how that feels and looks. And I would suggest that ultimately Canadian packers are going to pay effectively what U.S. packers are prepared to pay for live cattle, which would be market price less their import duty. So it will have a significant effect should tariffs be levied. What have we done in our operation? We've taken and we've looked at every risk management tool that we can consider, and we've actually managed the price risk on the vast majority of our 2025 sales. And does that cost us something? Absolutely, it does. But we're just unwilling to live with this uncertainty all year long.
And I think it is important to understand. Yeah, I think back 10 years ago or 15 years ago now, almost, when we were working together previously, getting kind of that price risk tool established was an important part of the agenda. And I think clearly there's opportunities for governments to go further to make that a more meaningful tool to farmers in this context. But in this broader question around the need for compensation, ultimately, how you've been on the head of a farm lobby group. You've also been a provincial finance minister. I think we're in this space where there's going to be a lot of demands and a lot of pressures from a lot of different places potentially to come in and help farmers, but also small businesses and employees and others that are impacted by this. How do you think that this potential compensation space is going to unfold, and where do you see that going as we get into this world of potential hurt?
Sure. Well, that's a great question. I think we need to go back to first principles when we consider, support, should we be, with tariff action. And, the first principle is this, that programs shouldn't provide a disincentive for producers to manage their own price risk. That's the reality. And, right now in the cattle industry, we have some options out there. And so we should all be looking at those options. And will they cost us something? They will. But, that's the reality of being an international trader. There's an element of price risk because we trade globally, and we need to take advantage of those tools. So again, number one principle support programs shouldn't provide material disincentive for producers and agriculture operations from managing their own price risk. Principle number 2 is I think we need to be careful with any programming that it doesn't completely blunt market signals. We've seen programs that have been developed that do blunt those market signals, and in a prolonged event, that can be extremely problematic. In fact, very destructive to the economics of the industry. And so, a couple of first principles that need to be considered. I think the first response would probably be to use existing programs and tweak those programs. We've seen, a tweak in the agri-stability program here very recently with respect to, strengthening coverage. And I think that's likely going to be the first response. And particularly, right now where we have a caretaker government, we're in election mode. My expectation is over the next month, that's the kind of programming that we're going to see. In the event, this is a really prolonged trade action, then it will be really important that industry roll up their sleeves and go to work to develop some programming solutions that can work for the industry, perhaps in the intermediate term. But again, I want to just draw attention to those first principles. I think they really matter.
And how do you think the uncertainty and volatility plays into this, right? Because one of the challenges is, you talked about the potential for a prolonged situation. We don't know. What we have seen over the last couple of months is the US president ratchets up the pressure and then backs off. He ratchets up the pressure and then backs off. I think we're already seeing on April 2nd this potential for tariffs, but already messaging about the potential to back off. So how do you, again, when you're thinking about some of the hats that you want, how do you deal with this reality that we really don't know what the impact is going to be? And one of the questions in the chat was could CAPI do some work on modeling it? And I'll say, I think we all need to figure out what assumptions we're going to use when we're trying to figure out what the impact is, and that's a very difficult thing to assess. So how do you think about the way that uncertainty plays into, again, how governments are going to react, but also how producers and others are going to react too?
Yeah, uncertainty in the business world is almost worse than a poor reality, and so we're dealing with a world of uncertainty right now, and yet we can't be caught in paralysis. I think we as producers, operators in the agriculture industry need to do all we can to manage our price risk, manage with that uncertainty. And I do think there could be a role for organizations such as CAPI to do some modeling. I talked about what I believe will be the realities in the cattle industry. Should we have any kind of a prolonged tariff event on live cattle with the U.S., the effect on beef will be a little bit different than it will be on live cattle, because obviously Canadian processors have other options. They can backfill beef into Eastern Canada. They can, go globally with more product. But on the live cattle front, I think, the results will be pretty direct.
Great. Well, we'll get into some more of that, what else we can do after. Thank you very much, Travis, for joining in. We'll bring in our third panelist now, and that is Tyler Bjornson. Tyler is a seasoned public affairs executive with a large network amongst government and industry stakeholders in Canada and around the world. He's worked as the chief of staff Oh, sorry, I'm not sure if you could hear me there. I think I may have hit mute.
I got hit mute on me, but now I can hear you, so we're good.
Okay, all right. So this is so Tyler, you've seen this kind of trade dynamics and how things play out, and inside government, outside of government, as a trade negotiator, but also inside a business. You also do work in a couple of different sectors, and I want to start to talk about China with you. How does that play out, and what is the impact of the fact that we're in a trade war today, not just on the Canada-US front, but the Canada-China front as well? So can you walk us through kind of the state of play in your mind of how things are with China and how that relates to how things are going with the United States?
I think Canada and Canadian agriculture producers and exporters have seen over the decades many circumstances where they had a major trading partner, in my terminology, a major trading partner behaving badly, and having to react to those circumstances. Certainly, we've seen China, India, the EU, and others implement measures, sometimes technical barriers to trade, sometimes political, sometimes tariff oriented, and cause major disruption. But I can't really recall a time when we've seen our two largest export markets at the same time kind of hammer and tong with us on the tariff front. That is unique, and it's something very different. And so I don't think there are any simple answers when you have two markets that for many of the agriculture subsectors constitute 60 or 70+% of your total production. I think it's very easy to say, oh, we just need to diversify our trade when faced with the immediate reality of where the heck do I sell my products now that my two largest customers aren't a competitive option, at least in the short term. And so, Tyler, I think I like the proverb that necessity is the mother of all invention. And so from my perspective, the longer that Canadian agriculture is exposed to trade friction with both China and the United States, the more likely it is that you see some of that structural change that you asked at the beginning poll, that you see some of that starting to take shape. And from my point of view, I think lots of Canadians are probably thinking that this is a wake-up call. I couldn't agree more, and I think it's a wake-up call in particular for the government, both federal and provincial, on the agri-food sector, because I think we've been in this sort of Rapunzel-like dozing period for a long time, just kind of chugging along, doing our thing, and happily selling our products, but not really thinking about a strategy. And maybe I just add one last thing here, is it's super frustrating when you see over the years reviews and commissions and councils and white papers and blue ribbon panels and everybody and their dog weighing in and giving recommendations about what we ought to do in our sector, and very little implementation of a lot of the recommendations that are coming out of those suggestions. So hopefully this is the kick in the pants we all need to actually act on many of recommendations that have been made, especially, for example, in the Barton report and now a decade ago.
Right, and so often, Tyler, lately I've been thinking that in the context of what this kick in the pants should tell us is that we need generational change in agriculture policy in this country. And this, it's been 25 years since our ag policy framework was agreed to. The world has changed since then, but how we do ag policy in this country really hasn't. But at the core of all of this, Tyler, I guess I'm curious as to how you talk about the challenges of trade diversification. How much of the solution needs to come from finding solutions to address these issues with China and the United States?
Well, I think that our politicians of every stripe and our trade negotiators are extremely focused on trying to find solutions on that. Of that, I have no doubt. I think everyone clear across the country understands just how dramatic of an impact this is going to have on the Canadian economy. I dare say, though, that I think there's my hunch is that there's an underestimation in some political circles in the United States about just how big the impact is going to be on Americans. And because of that, I still hold out a lot of hope that this is short-term friction, short-term reverberations that we're dealing with, and that we can find negotiated outcomes with the United States in particular on this side. I think that's important, and I think that's going to happen, but I think we're going to go through some pretty significant turbulence in the meantime. But maybe I could just talk about trade diversification for a second. And from my perspective, the best market diversification strategy is not running around to global trade shows. I think that's a really poor, uncreative way to deal with trade diversification. I think first and foremost, our domestic market offers a ton of opportunity, and I saw in the questions there somebody asking about that. I think that's a big opportunity for Canadian agriculture to change Canadian consumer habits about what they're buying and from whom and which countries, and highlighting that, hey, there are a lot of fantastic Canadian-made products out there that you're, to this point, you were buying competitors from either US made or perhaps elsewhere. I think that's a big deal. I think things like the biofuels policy, that's a really big deal when you've got, I can only imagine how the canola crushers are faring right now when you've got their two largest markets of the US and China. That's a really important policy, for example, to shelter, that's maybe the wrong word, to create opportunity for them to have another market and not be so exposed. And then lastly, it always mystifies me that we have this foreign investment strategy in Canada, but we tend to spend a lot of time running around looking for new capital from outside of Canada, when the oldest marketing trick in the book is to upsell an existing customer. So I think governments in Canada really need to be focused on actually causing the current companies and organizations that have invested in Canada in value-added processing to actually get them to spend more, because they already know what Canada's about. They're comfortable being here. They're often multinational, large organizations that are willing to invest more. I think we really need to think about how to incentivize them to do more in Canada.
And I think it's important to highlight that we have, over the last 5 years, seen pretty significant capital investment in value-added agriculture in Canada. I think we often take that for granted, but it's important, I think, also to understand that much of that has been driven by reliable market access to the United States that's now at risk. Tyler, just finally, before I bring the other panelists back in, I do think it's important to get into the difference between China and the United States. You talked about kind of the impact of these tariffs in Washington or across the United States, the leverage that gives us, and hopefully mitigating the potential impact with the US market. What leverage, how do you see that relationship playing out in China? And what do you think the approach is that gets to a better outcome with China at the end of the day?
The China situation is a really interesting question. And I think when President Trump was first elected, and he was talking a lot about tariffs on China and Canada and Mexico in particular, I thought it was quite remarkable when the new minister counselor economic for the Embassy of China here in Canada came out and said some remarks that Canada and China really need to rethink its trading relationship. I personally thought that was a signal from Beijing that, hey, the US is beating up on both of us. We really need to talk again to make sure that we can remain steady trading partners while we're weathering that storm. So I have to say, I was pretty caught off guard by China coming back and whacking Canada with 100% tariffs on the value-added canola products and peas. That really surprised me. And of course, you have the outstanding anti-dumping investigation on canola. Beef has been out of the Chinese market for many years on a pretense around BSE. Pork's really concerned, right? Like, there's a lot of exposure. I would have thought China would have said, hey, Canada, let's sit down. I'd like to make sure that we can get strong supply of certain products while we're fighting with the United States on tariffs. And that hasn't been the case. So that playbook is thrown out the window. And now it's kind of like, well, what do we do with China? Do we continue to march to the US's drummer on electric vehicle tariffs and aluminum and steel tariffs on China? Or do we say, hey, United States, you're not doing us any favors in those markets, and you want us to follow your global policy direction on that? I don't know. That's a head scratcher to me. And if I were, back in positions of influence on these topics, I probably would be saying, I want to keep the bird in hand and not two in the bush. In other words, the several $1 billion worth of agricultural exports that we're sending to China, why would we toss that out when we've, for a hope and a prayer on EV related markets sometime down the road?
And so I want to kind of build on that now with Travis and Greg again, because I think there's some concern, though, Tyler, that it's not that we're kind of trading canola access to China for potential EV jobs. It's that we're trading canola access to China to maintain this fortress North America, or this united front on trade. But I'll go back to our question that's got the most upvotes right now, which is effectively, how can we trust the U.S. is going to remain committed to whatever trade agreement or solution we get at the end of the day? And again, and how do we think that then should influence how we consider our relationships with China or Europe or others from a trade perspective? And so maybe Ambassador Dowd, I'll go to you first on this. Again, I think that there is this concern in Canada that if we go through all of this effort to negotiate a better outcome, how do we think about the sustainability of that outcome, whatever that agreement is that gets negotiated at the end of the day?
Oh, I don't think you have to worry about that. I think that's a little bit of a misnomer. Look, my relationship with Canada and ag trade goes back to my U.S. wheat days in the 1990s. And we fought tooth and nail, the U.S. wheat industry and the Canadian Wheat Board. There was all kinds of friction there. Fast forward to the 2000s, Travis and I worked very closely on mad cow and the beef issues, and we had a tremendous relationship. And I would completely agree with Travis's assessment when it comes to cattle and beef trade. We're causing friction and tariffs in the middle of all that. Dairy as well is not the right thing to do, because stuff goes back and forth back across the border in lots of different ways. We import several hundred million from Canada, and we export several hundred million to Canada. But every now and then there are things that have to be tweaked and fixed, and sometimes you get ag trade issues get caught up in the broader context of the bigger discussion, and we'll sort it through.
Travis, are you confident that we'll be able to sort it through? And how do you think about that kind of dynamic around kind of the trust in the relationship with the United States going forward?
Well, that's a great question right now. If, as Canadians, I think we really need to ask that question in terms of, who do we think there's a rational long-term play with? Because here's the reality. We are agriculture traders. We simply are going to produce far more than we can consume in our nation. And so we are going to be trade dependent in a global environment where trade's getting harder. That's the other reality out there. I really squirm. I push back when Canada gets, lumped in with China. Let's face it, China's been a fickle trading partner. From my perspective, China's been a fickle trading partner to the nation of Canada. And certainly on the beef side, and Tyler kind of noted that. I believe in the Fortress North American approach, and I think you're going to see trade agreements that are much bigger than just trade as we go forward. There's greater geopolitical tension these days. Trade agreements are going to, I believe, ultimately solidify around geopolitical lines. And who are our allies, right? I mean, obviously, the U.S. is going to be an important ally down the road. That's our reality in North America. We're going to have to play hardball right now. In my view, Canada can't roll over, but I believe that playing hardball will be worth it to get to an appropriate end. The other thing we as Canadians need to face up to, we're dependent on trade. We're a trading nation, particularly in agriculture. And trade agreements that have ongoing irritants are not going to be sustainable. We have an ongoing irritant right now in dairy. We pointed it out for years in the cattle and beef industry, and we paid the price at times for that irritant. My hope would be that our next prime minister is going to, effectively propose moving up USMCA negotiations as a concession immediately. And as Canadians, everything needs to be on that table, because trade agreements that are going to have persistent irritants are not going to be solid and dependable trade agreements.
And I think, Travis, it's again I know the review clause in USMCA, ruffled some feathers when it was first agreed to, but it does create this relief valve to deal with pressure and should take some of the pressure off of kind of blowing things up. And it's worth noting we don't have that review clause in the Canada-EU free trade agreement, and we don't have that same mechanism in that case then to go back and try and review those things. And Tyler, I want to use kind of that relationship with Europe as a way to talk about the fact that, again, Canada and the United States do have much more in common together. You've done work around the world on grain trade issues, and I think it's probably fair to say that Canada and the United States often have far more in common on our approach to these issues than Canada and Europe do. How do you think, again, in the context of trying to build more support for this Fortress North America, understanding that, again, we are often the best allies, Canada and the United States, and how that compares to, again, trying to change that relationship with Europe and others?
Yeah, it's super interesting because I tend to agree with what Greg and Travis said about, in the medium, or hopefully not long term, hopefully it's medium term, we're going to sort things out with the United States. I think we're going to have continue to enjoy a solid economic relationship with one another. There's too much at stake economically, politically, and from a security point of view to not have that relationship. And it doesn't make any sense to not repair it and put it back on a really solid founding and track, with a footnote. And that footnote it includes, I'm a bit concerned about the U.S. Tending to be much more inward looking, and its effect on rules-based trade globally, because and proponent, for example, of innovation, making sure that regulation of innovation in agri-food products is accepted and we're able to freely trade around the world. It's been one of the biggest irritants for both Canadian and American agri-food exports. In the grain trade, you talked about it. We face continually struggles with the European Union on crop inputs and crop protection products, seed technology, for example. And I think we need, as Canada, to think about, if the United States is not willing to play that role to the same extent it has in the past, then how can we play more of a leadership role in that, given how much is at stake for us on agri-food exports? And lastly, I would just like to point out that while it's very difficult to replace that fickle partner of 1.4, 1.5 billion people over in China, there are a growing number of markets that are really going to be important for Canada, I believe, in the future. It's these middle powers that Canada should be bringing together and talking about agri-food trade related items with. It includes countries like Indonesia. It includes countries like Japan, Mexico. I dare say Brazil is included in there, but it also includes countries like Nigeria, that we're selling more and more wheat to, and has a really burgeoning population, and they can't possibly feed themselves. So I think Canada needs to think about what's its strategy and how does it play a leadership role with those middle and growing powers that are out there that are going to want a lot of what we produce.
And so, Greg, how do you think about that inward turn that we're seeing in the United States? And U.S. dairy producers have an aggressive export agenda. That's not, often in the Canadian context, but around the world. You've got your own challenges with the European Union. How do you see that playing out going forward?
Well, Tyler, I understand that sentiment, and that's the challenge of the U.S. system. Is politically, we seem to these days, administration to administration, swing the pendulum from one extreme to the other. So, in terms of ag trade and market access, we've spent the last 4 years with the tractor buried in mud up to its axle, and now all of a sudden we're doing 80 on the interstate. And everybody's kind of like, wait a minute, what's going on? What is the strategy? So I completely understand that sentiment. That's kind of a failure of our system as it works in terms of elections. But I would share this sentiment, Tyler. When it comes to the European Union, I've been in Washington almost 33 years, studied this stuff. If we get a chance to get after the European Union on ag trade, U.S. agriculture will bring the gas and the matches to the party, man. I'm telling you. Our ag trade deficit with the European Union and the U.S. is $23.6 billion. We export to the EU essentially the same amount in dollars that we did in 1980. It hasn't changed in 45 years. In dairy, we import 3 billion from the EU. We export 167 million. Out of 8.3 billion in trade, 167 million of that goes to the EU. We export 15 times more cheese to Guatemala than we do the European Union. Right. And so
frustrating.
Yeah. It's outrageous.
Yeah. Well, we have our own experience in Canada with European trade with the CETA agreement. There was supposed to be great promise for beef and pork and grains and oilseeds, and I dare say that has fallen not just flat, but it's deflated to the point where you've got a 30 million, like next to zero for beef going into Europe, next to zero going in for pork going into Europe, and yet we've got an import balance of 30 million per year of beef products coming from the EU and 200 million for pork products coming from the EU as a result of that agreement. So it's a bit of a head scratcher in that sense. And I really hope, Greg, that Canada and the US are, hand in hand, really taking the Europeans to task about not letting agriculture products into that market.
But I completely agree that on the global front, when it comes to things like Codex and the international standards and SPS issues, we actually historically have worked very closely together, and we have to lock arms on that going forward in the future. We just have to.
And so I'm going to try and combine a couple of questions into one, and maybe this won't be very elegant, but again, we've got this comment again when you look at fentanyl and illegal immigration, which was a driver of this first set of actions, and Canada really not being the problem. It's Mexico that's the problem. We've had dispute settlement on dairy, but we acknowledge that there's an opportunity to review that through the USMCA rules, and yet we kind of keep hearing the context of Canada not living up to its kind of agreement, and then this is why we need to kind of go through this whole effort. Maybe Travis, I'll go to you to say that again, even I think that the irritants that do exist in Canada, when you look at the facts, again, fentanyl and being what it is, and kind of the trade working relatively well, but yet kind of there's these bigger irritants we all face all around the world together. I know that the beef industry, for example, beef producers in Canada and the United States, and work very closely together on these issues. What are the different things that we need to do to try and find ways to move past this? And there's an interesting question around kind of who's the right Canadian to rebuild this relationship. And maybe I'll kind of change that a little bit to say what's the right kind of personality, what's the right kind of approach that we need to do to try and get past kind of the issues around breaking rules that I don't think are necessarily really there, and into kind of solutions at the end of the day. What should we be looking for from leaders in the sector and in government and civil society to fix this?
Yeah, that's a bunch of questions, Tyler. Look, I have to say this right now. With President Trump's approach, we as Canadians have been taken aback. We've been offended. I think it's fair to say, with our closest neighbor, trading partner, ally. A country that we not only share trade with, we share family with. I've got a son in New York City right now, veterinarian, and so we feel disrespected as a country, and yet we've got to work through this, and we're at an uncomfortable time. We're going to need strong visionary leadership in Canada that can defend our national interests. We're going to need strong leadership that can cast a vision for this nation and work on issues that have been neglected for well over 10 years. And those are issues of competitiveness. We have some really poor underlying numbers economically and fiscally in this nation. And business investment in Canada is about where it was in 2015, like 10 years ago. We have declining productivity relative to the US, which is of huge concern. We have trade barriers interprovincially that need attention. We have an inability to get big projects done, projects of national importance, because we get all caught up in issues that at the end of the day are not grounded in reality. Folks, we have an opportunity to grow up as a nation right now, and we're going to need leadership. We're going to need the next prime minister that's willing to be bold and ultimately deal with issues of competitiveness, those ones that I've just laid out. It's going to be important as well that I believe that we recognize the long-term value of Fortress North America, because I believe that is our future. Again, we're going to have to defend our interests right now during this very uncomfortable time and do that well and do that with strength, but also be able to cast a vision for what we can accomplish together. And as I mentioned before, trade relationships now, I believe, are going to be far more encompassing than they have been in the past. And we're going to have to deal practically and pragmatically with those irritants that we have been putting up for years. We're going to have to deal with issues such as, our defense spending, for instance. That's been an irritant with the U.S., and rightly so. We've got to, again, that's part of growing up as a country. And it's time we deal with those issues head on. So it's going to take bold leadership in Canada, and I trust that Canadians are evaluating not only the leaders of our major parties, but also the people that will make up the government, to ensure that they have that kind of leadership character that is going to take Canada the next step and stage.
So Tyler, when you think about kind of evaluating this, and again, you also have a political background, what are the things, again, without getting maybe into the partisan politics, what are the things that you want to hear Canadian leaders saying about these issues? And Sean's going to pop back in the conversation, and maybe Greg, once Tyler's done, you could just speak to, on the U.S. side, what does that kind of leadership look like that we need to see to try and get this to a better outcome? But Tyler, thinking about what Travis just said, what do you want to hear from politicians in this election campaign?
Yeah, I think it's a twofold message. One is exactly what Travis said, which is you've got a firm, strong hand and a strong message, and that Canada wants to work in North America. It's not about appeasement. It's about recognizing that we have shared interests together, and saying it's in neither of our interests for us to spiral down into a massively painful and detrimental trade war. We will defend our interests to the nth degree, but we don't think that's a necessary path to go down. We think it's better to talk and negotiate our way through that outcome. At the same time, I think it is absolutely critical that we have our elected officials saying, now is the time to have a good old house cleaning party, to make sure that our regulatory space that guides investments, that guides new innovation, that guides new products and services in our sector is actually shaped for not just safety, which is that's the table stakes. Everybody knows that. You have to have regulations in place to have safe, healthy, and environmentally friendly products. We know that. But there's a way to do that that's friendly to growth, and there's a way that we're currently doing it which stifles it. And so I think we need to have a political class that says, we recognize we're not doing ourselves any favors on that front. Let's get at it and regulate for growth.
I've been sitting here. Oh, you guys have done a great job. Fantastic work. Greg, I got a question for you. A lot has been made about the way that Canada has reacted or hasn't reacted to some of the threats around tariffs. Canada's strategy has been to be, we're retaliating, and we're going to stick up for Canadians, and it's a political angle, not necessarily an economic angle. Mexico, President Sheinbaum's been much less reactive up front, a little bit more, she's got an 85% approval rating, so maybe she's afforded the ability to do this. But it's been a bit quieter in terms of well, let's just see what the tariffs look like, and then we will decide how we're going to react. Based on you know a lot of people in that room, how should Canada be reacting to some of the threats and some of the things that are said?
Sean, it's a great question. And here's the advice that I would give. And again, this is just my own personal observations is, when our president does what he does, the first reaction should be to get on a plane and go to Mar-a-Lago and sit down and say, okay, what do we need to do? And your prime minister did that early on. But again, this is my perception from the U.S. side of the equation is what seems to have happened here is at the top of the world, our two leaders just didn't get along from a personality standpoint or whatever it was. And that's unfortunate for all of us. And so now that there's a change here, hopefully that can be remedied in the future. Because I think, me being an old Kansas farm boy and knowing Travis the way I do, Travis, deputize the two of us, we'll sit down, we can sort this stuff out in an afternoon. I mean, that's not a problem. We do see eye to eye on most of these things. And what's interesting is, from my perspective, in my old cattleman days, we'd sit down with the Mexican ranchers and sort it out and then tell our respective governments, no, this is what we want you to do. And it would work very well. And so we need to get back to some of that, Sean, is probably my answer to the question.
Yeah, what I've been... Travis, I couldn't agree more with this Fortress North America as a solution for Canada's way out of this, or to a better side of it. But Travis, you also said something that I think what we've seen is in all of this is a hyperbolic version of our cultures. American culture tends to be very direct and like, let's get down to it. We'll be friends. We'll go to the lake and we will drink beer. But how are we gonna, what does this business deal look like? Canada is much more relationship focused. And Canada has spent a lot of time being offended and being hurt, as opposed to, okay, yes, I am. Let's get over this and get to the brass tacks and sort this out. Travis, how do we get past this Canadian culture of being so offended by something somebody has said at the White House?
Well, I mean, ultimately, we're going to have to get over it. The reality, we've been taken aback as Canadians. I think to Tyler's McCann's first kind of question, we thought we had a trade agreement, and with the opportunity to obviously tweak it and renegotiate it in due time. But that agreement has not seemed to matter to the current U.S. administration, and that's concerning. So we've been taken aback as a country. But look, Sean, to your point, we've got to get past that. And ultimately, I believe that we need to recognize that, a sound future for our nation includes a solid relationship with our closest neighbor, trading partner, and ally. And we need to sit down. That's why I'm suggesting that the next prime minister should really offer to move up negotiation of USMCA immediately.
Yeah.
And have the boldness and courage to put everything on the table. It's time we recognize that we're a trading nation, and stop taking such a hypocritical approach to agriculture trade. It's time.
Yeah. So Devin has a question here in the chat, and I think it's a good one. And it refers back to, if you go back to Commodity Classic, first week of March, the president put out a post on Truth Social, Greg, that referred to like American farmers like being happy and have fun with the domestic market. And it was a very odd sort of angle. Is there, like, Devin's question is, how do U.S. farmers think President Trump, what do they think when President Trump tells them they should be happy to focus on their domestic market? Why that's, do they feel that not enough Americans have been buying U.S. products, or is it less focus on trade? Where's the angle there from the White House, from your perspective?
Well, I'm not going to lie to you, Sean. I thought it was an odd comment too, and I'm not quite sure what he meant by it. Okay. So I don't know how to answer the question. Yeah. We are not quite as trade dependent as Canada and New Zealand and Australia, but nonetheless, we still are. And right now, all of our challenge, Bob Lighthizer talks about this, Sean. We have to have a great tax policy, regulatory policy, fiscal policy, interest rates, et cetera, to be competitive. And what his point is, I don't know what in the U.S. the right combination of those things are. So a little bit of tariff helps level the playing field. That's his view in terms of an industrial policy, and it makes a lot of sense. But from a U.S. Standpoint, we have to be able to export. There's just no two ways about it. And right now on the grain side of the equation, the competition from Brazil combined with the softness of the Chinese economy, I've said this many times, you can have free trade agreements with the rest of the world, but if the Chinese economy continues to be where it is right now in terms of demand for food, you can't offset it. You just can't. And so all of us are in a real pickle here in the food business right now because of the softness of the Chinese economy.
Well, that's because you're talking about trade diversification. That's the same issue where it's, we hear, and I've seen a little bit in the chat here, where it's like, forget about the Americans, let's just focus on China, or hey, let's forget about China and the U.S. and we'll lower interprovincial trade barriers and everything's gonna be fine. It's like, no, that dog don't hunt. That math does not work out in anybody's test. And McCann, you've talked a lot about how people mention interprovincial trade barriers as a solution, but that makes sense at 100,000 feet. But at 30,000, we actually get into the details. Much harder to do.
Well, and I think it's important to kind of, in a lot of these things, right, we need to understand what are the actual issues that are standing in the way. And in ag and food, again, we've got issues around trucking and moving products east-west, but I think we've gotten caught up in interprovincial trade barriers as an issue. And even accessing the domestic market more is not an easy thing to do in this context, right? Like none of these solutions are short-term solutions that can have a meaningful impact. And they do get back to, we need to create an investment community or an investment environment where somebody's going to come in and invest in domestic value added in a way that will help us to better serve that. But even then, there are limitations when we grow a lot of wheat and canola and produce a lot of beef in this country. We just can't consume enough of it at the end of the day, and we are that trading partner. And I guess I go back to this kind of Chinese dynamic because it has been really top of mind in Western Canada as we've seen these tariffs play out. And I'm curious, Tyler, really, I'm not sure that there's a right answer around how you balance that China-US relationship at the end of the day. But when I hear Greg talk about it, it makes me think again that one of the solutions should be Canada and the US managing that Chinese relationship together and with kind of the same approach, but I'm not sure that that's possible. How Tyler, how do you think about that trade-off at the end of the day, and how do we find out how that actually practically fits into it, even then when we've got choke points and other issues around infrastructure shipping east?
Yeah, we haven't even talked about rail service performance and all of the challenges that we have around that. The fact that we've got two geographic monopolies for railways that behave in certain ways that aren't always advantageous for agri-food exporters. Those are massive challenges. Again, on that internal domestic house cleaning front, we really need to think about those things. They should be high up on our agenda about what to do. But then to talk about the U.S. and China, I actually don't see it as a trade-off. I think that's not really a realistic way to think about the triangle of Canada, U.S. And China. I personally always see China as an opportunistic market. When it's open, we send a lot because they want it. To Greg's point, the market's probably not soft and they want a lot of what we produce because they need it. India's the same way, right? Like where you've got, fumigation measures or tariff issues or non-tariff barriers that come on and off, depending on, what the domestic supply situation is in India. So I think Canada just needs to sort itself out with the United States, figure out what our relationship is there. And you know what? Can we trust them now? No, not necessarily 100%, but now maybe it's 98% instead of 100. But I think we really need to sort out our relationship with the United States first. And when China wants our goods, okay, we'll deal with China. But I don't see it as an effective strategy to play China off on the United States in our discussions with them. And then lastly, I would just say, in my time as a negotiator at Foreign Affairs for Canada, I was always mystified by our real Boy Scout approach to international trade negotiations and market access issues. What do I mean by that? We have this mantra that it's all about the global rules-based trading system, and we don't link issues. Well, clearly, the current president is linking issues. We may not like those issues. We may completely disagree with the facts that he's presenting on those issues, but he's linking issues, many of them all at once. And I think to be successful with them, I think we have to talk about security and issues at the border. I think we need to talk about defense spending. I think we need to talk about the trading relationship. It's clear that President Trump wants to talk about all those things, whether we like it or not. And I think it would be important for us to consider all of those things together.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to build on that is, I think a lot of Canadians mistake that President Trump represents all Americans' thoughts on the relationship with Canada and trade. Not true. Also not true is, you reverse it, just like Prime Minister Trudeau doesn't represent the beliefs of all Canadians. So I think we need to kind of stop with that sort of assumption and maybe drop some of the naivety that is out there. So Canada all of a sudden has developed amnesia in regards to what it's like to do business with China. Fresh off, say, the 2 Michael situation, we sort of forgot about that. Just like the U.S. is naive about opening up trade relationships with India, as if a free trade agreement is going to be negotiated this afternoon, and then we're going to go play golf when it's all over. As we heard Secretary Rollins say at Top Producer Summit, I think India could be, and Senator Marshall was the one that led it from Kansas, Greg's state. Talk about how India could be the biggest market for U.S. ag products. I'm not too sure about that, because if you don't like trade with China, let me introduce you to their neighbor India. It's a lot more complex than that. That's just my thoughts.
And maybe,
Yes,
Sean,
it is.
we can wrap up, and Travis, will go to you first with this, because I think this really comes down to then, so where do we go next? And maybe if we could get everybody just to go around the room and kind of like, what are the 1 or 2 things that you think that we need to do to kind of fix this relationship? And you can deal with that in the Canada-US relationship in context. You can deal with it maybe in the global rules-based trading system. You can deal with it in domestic policy, but let's give you all the opportunity to kind of really get into 1 or 2 concrete things that we, the global we, should be doing to try and fix the situation.
Sure. Well, I'm going to suggest 2 things. Number 1, this is an opportunity, again, as I've mentioned, I think as others have too, for us to really grow up as a nation. And, we talked about infrastructure deficiency. Tyler mentioned our rail challenge. Right now, we need a prime minister and we need a government here, post-election, that's going to recognize that we need to build major infrastructure to our ports. And whether that's enhancing our rail system to move our agriculture goods to market and diversify our market opportunities, or whether that's building and fast tracking pipeline approvals so we can become that energy superpower that we really need to be as a nation. We need to get our own house in order, grow up as a country, and focus on those key issues that improve our competitiveness, of productivity, and ultimately wealth creation. And I'm hopeful, and I believe that Canadians are increasingly becoming supportive of that agenda. Number 2, I think we do need to, again, recognize the incredibly important relationship that we have and will have with the United States for years and decades to come. Roll up our sleeves and be willing to put everything on the table to ensure that we have a mutually beneficial trade relationship and relationship in general. Because the reality is that's going to be our future as well. So 2 things.
Thanks. Tyler, to you, what are the 2 things that you think, 1 or 2 things that you think we should be doing to respond to the situation?
Well, as I've said a couple of times now, I think we need a strong look inwardly about what we're doing to make Canadian agri-food sector stronger. There's been tons of reviews and recommendations made. I think we actually need to follow through on some of those recommendations. And I think we need to have cool, strong heads and sit down with the United States and hammer out a deal that addresses all of the issues that are clearly being raised by the president, some of which are going to be difficult and uncomfortable to address, and some of which I think we can overcome with level-headed conversations.
Thank you, Greg. It may be a dangerous thing to ask an American what Canada should do these days, but what are one or two things that you think that Canada should be doing to respond going forward?
I think Travis said it well, and I'll go back to the first thing I said is that no one gets access to the U.S. consumer for free anymore, and the president is Donald Trump is a U.S. leader that says he wants it built here in the U.S. and he's going to drive an agenda to do that. So I think very simply what Canadian leaders can do is appeal to him to say, okay, here's how we can do that to the benefit of both nations. And I think President Trump and all of the U.S. is completely open to that conversation because we are very close. We're close allies, trading partners. Let's work together. But understand what, you have to work on the messaging and how to steal the deal and sell the deal to this administration.
Yeah. And I think it'll be interesting to see whoever our prime minister ends up being at the end of April, how well they're able to do that and what difference they make, and how well, to the things that Travis and Tyler have said, they can show the leadership needed to actually get things done in this country and deliver, I think, the generational change that we need on agriculture policy issues. Sean, before I hand it back to you, I just want to say thank you to Tyler, to Ambassador Dowd, and to Travis for joining us in this discussion today. Again, clearly this is a defining issue for Canadian agriculture and food. But I do think it really is important to highlight that it's happening in a context where we have our own domestic issues. And I think hopefully it's the kick in the butt that we need to get things done going forward. So stay tuned to the work that CAPI is doing as we try and offer our thoughts around what that looks like and how that can move going forward. And again, the risk report survey is in the chat. Please take the time to fill that out so we can hear from you what your perspectives are on these risks and what we should be doing to them. So thank you again to our panelists, and Sean, I'll hand it over to you for the final wrap up.
Yeah, thanks a lot to everybody. This has been fantastic. I was saying to one of the audience members that was watching, this is my worlds colliding, and it's been great to bring everybody together here, which has been fantastic. And we heard is that there is an opportunity. These are tough. There's some friction right now, and that's fine. But there is an opportunity on the other side of this. We just got to find a way to get to that end goal. I heard Ambassador Dowd just say, the idea of how Canada fits into this U.S. planet, but talking a lot about, let's stop talking about integrated supply chains and talk about complementary supply chains, how the two countries working together, and let's include Mexico in that, three countries functioning more as an economic zone and really leveraging us against some of the nefarious characters out there like China and Brazil. Those are bigger threats to our way of living here in North America than the three of us countries battling it out on a daily basis. Canada just has to get past the stage of being treated like a kick toy and get to what is the ask and what are the KPIs that we need to deliver in combination together to get to the other side of it. I want to thank all of our panelists, all the audience for tuning in here today. This has been fantastic. As Tyler said, CAPI is doing some great work. We've been really collaborating together to provide information on topics like this and more, and encourage everybody to check out realagriculture.com. And of course, you can always tune in to Real Ag Radio on Rural Radio 147 Sirius XM at 4:30 Eastern, or wherever you get your podcast. Thanks for tuning in, everybody, here today. There will be a recording available, and we'll talk to you next time. Cheers, everybody.